We all ready?
Go ahead and call the finance committee meeting to order. Both of our members are present.
Yes, always.
Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So move.
Second?
Any public comment? Oh, hearing none, we can stand and say the pledge. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good to go with it?
Yeah, go ahead. I just
Okay.
want also to acknowledge that Mr. Giles needs to leave at 3 o'clock, so if you need to continue the discussion, we can do so. Privately, having just one member who doesn't constitute a committee anymore, so.
Sure.
We'll get through as much as we can. So,
Yeah, we'll get
all right.
rolling here. If you have questions along the way, just feel free to ask. Since some of these numbers traditionally are pretty small on the screen, I went ahead and printed some out for you. Thank you. We'll start with that first page, if we can kind of follow along with the FY19-20 tentative budget. So we have all the funds, or all 9 funds, starting with their beginning fund balance from last year, which, as we know from the July financial update, ended pretty poorly with the lack of the second largest payment in the FY19 property tax cycle. So we did end the year with some negative fund balances. Of course, that was the property taxes at work there. Along with, we got projected revenue, projected expenditures, and then the ending cash balance and the net change. The orange bar at the bottom, towards the bottom, is the specifics to operating funds, education, O&M, transportation, and working cash. Kind of where we start and where we are projected to end as of this tentative budget. Just a few items of note at the bottom, just some of the highlights, I guess, starting with the expenditures. Of course, it does include the scheduled MSEA raises, along with any staff changes, retirees, added positions, which we'll get to on the next slide. The previously board approved purchase of the Chromebooks for 6th and 9th graders in FY20, and the previously board approved textbook adoption with the science textbooks. So that, of course, other expenditures as well, but those are kind of the highlights as we go into FY20. On the revenue end, like I started off saying, the $4.4 million that we did receive in property taxes in FY19, we did receive that payment in July, so that one did fall in FY20, further skewing
After this week, things
financials
will
for years to come.
kind of get in motion.
That is, of course, the reason why the projected revenue is absolutely heavier than normal, because it includes the payment that we should have received last fiscal year. For the 2019 tax levy, which is payable in 1920, or in 2020 rather, we're assuming a 4% increase in EAV. Last year we had about a 7.35% increase in EAV. We don't see any signs of that slowing down, so I think 4 is a pretty conservative approach to the income tax revenue moving forward for FY20.
We've used as low as 1 or 2 before, right?
We have, yeah, in years where it would get down to maybe 3%, we'd still be conservative and assume maybe half of that, but I think going into next year, especially with all the construction we're seeing in the community, I think 4 is pretty safe. I'm actually working, just got the phone with the county about an hour ago on attempting to get some estimated EAV numbers, so when I have those, I'll provide them to the finance committee as well. I'm kind of anxious to see what those are looking like.
So if we do the math of the 4.4
Right.
that's in this revenue that really shouldn't have been, and
Yeah.
our net change of 2.6 is not a net increase, really. In reality, in that education fund.
Oh, right. Oh, exactly.
All the taxes were more than just that fund, right?
Yes, yes. The
Across
4.4
board.
is
So
across all
4.4 really is
funds.
equivalent to that net change, then, isn't it?
Absolutely. So in fact, if you back off the 4.4 million off of the 41,490,000, if you back the 4.4 million off of that, we're within $8,700 of being balanced as compared to our projected expenditures. I just found that this morning too. Again, there's a spreadsheet, a very complex spreadsheet that goes into this whole summary, and when I backed that out and saw that, it's kind of shocking, but it worked out for me. It's weird. What else? Okay, so evidence-based funding, there's the hold harmless provision where we never go backwards, so we're receiving for our base funding minimum the total amount we received in FY19. So we'll start with that, but then we were also designated as a Tier 1 school district in evidence-based funding, which will result in an additional $509,000 in FY20. We've been, so this is the third year in evidence-based funding, and we've been Tier 2 in both of those years, kind of on the fence, but following to Tier 2. But this year is Tier 1, like we talked about in previous meetings. The governor recommended an increase to the formula of $375 million.
Louis, do you know where?
It's more than there has been in the last couple of years, so I think that has
What's our?
plenty to do.
Like, what's our, sorry, no, that's okay. Like,
Just
vanilla
just our
fertilizers.
need for more state funding. This is kind of proof of that. The formula is completely reflective of this, kicked out that Seymour is in need of additional funding. On the projected revenue side, we are also assuming, like we have for the last few years, 3 mandated categorical state payments. They caught up with 1 last year, so we've kind of taken the strategy, kind of the approach in the last few years. If we get 4, great, but let's just not assume that, take a conservative approach. And those categoricals are, the remaining after some of those were rolled into evidence-based funding. The remaining are special ed, private facility, and both transportation categorical programs. So we're going to assume 3 payments there, 1 from FY19, which will still be paid, and 2 from FY20. Also within the budget summary here, we're looking at a couple of permanent transfers, which we've traditionally done as well, to kind of align with those fund balance targets, so to speak. Working cash to O&M, I'm going to be recommending and building within the budget. $250,000 from working cash to operations and maintenance. The O&M fund took a little bit of it last year. We had a rough year with electrical costs from the weather, that kind of thing, with needing to heat and cool, but also quite a bit of repairs that needed to happen kind of on an emergency basis, and we paid those out of the O&M fund. But then also a permanent transfer from working cash to transportation in the amount of $200,000. Kind of keep those 2 funds at a more comfortable level for the fund balance. And like I said, next slide we'll get into the use of the Tier 1 funding. Any questions with anything else that I went through? When we look at days of cash on hand, we started the year with 40.8. Of course, it's quite low because of the property taxes, but as we inject that back in along with the items mentioned below, we'd be landing close to 83 days cash on hand. If there's no questions, we'll move on to the use of the Tier 1 funding. We had a few positions, some based on increased enrollment, others based on other discussion. Lindsay, would you want to kind of discuss some of these and how we got there? Okay.
Well, the most recent additions are kindergarten and first grade, and that was driven by an increase in enrollment that got us to some of the class size targets that we have set out in the past. So, we were really close, and just felt that at that time it was better to add instead of making that decision today. And it was a good thing because here we are, and we're at those targets. So added those. The other, the 5th special and the high school guidance counselor were items that were discussed in the springtime. Both driven, the high school guidance counselor has been a conversation on the table since I've gotten here, but I'm just going to guess that that was going on before I came. That was part of some budget cuts in like 2010 or 2011 when Pat Warren retired. That 3rd counseling position was never replaced. And so our 2 counselors at the high school have absorbed all that work, plus taking on the increase in enrollment so felt that that was a pretty critical area, not only for the counseling and academic side of it, but just working with our students and families and planning for the future. Fifth special here at Middletown Prairie was a conversation also that occurred pretty early last spring in terms of how can we continue to meet the social emotional needs of our youngest students, as well as assisting with, for lack of a better term, kind of loosening up the master schedule in this building. The enrollment, the number of sections, and the size of the building itself were driving some of that conversation. So in adding that, it was a number of different reasons. The social emotional piece was an important part of that, because this past year, 18-19, with the combining of Seymour and Middletown Prairie, we had 2 social workers here. And we knew that Nancy Cosner would be retiring. And so we had discussed also, and wrapped into this discussion about adding a 5th special here, was moving that open social work position to be split between the junior high and high school to also provide more social and emotional support for the older students that's needed there. And so this 5th special fills a lot of different needs. Coordinator of Student Services was the figure there just represents the increase in salary for Marissa Manuel, because we did not fill her position that she vacated. And then there's some other ancillary costs there that go along with starting up new classrooms, and those can be expected to. It's not just the cost of the teacher when you add a section, there's furniture, fixtures, and equipment. And then at the top of the list, junior high, high school library aid. Our librarians and media center specialists at the junior high and high school are kind of the lone ranger steering that ship. We have library aides here at Lincoln Trail, and just with the growth of our population, as well as the technology that's been infused into the buildings, they needed some support and help, so that was providing an aid was a way to do that. So those are some of the reasons behind that. These are all, the genesis of how we got to these positions. The starting point is discussions in our leadership team with our building principals, and just administratively discussing where are our needs, what are we seeing, and where can we use staff. I also want to make clear that there's a list of needs, and unfortunately we can't do everything. There's some prioritizing and discussion that goes with that to figure out where we can kind of have the highest leverage and make the most impact. And we're already starting to talk about what can we add, what will we need looking forward for 2021.
That's a good list. Can you recall over the last few years where we added teachers? Was it 1st grade also last year? Kindergarten?
Last year was kindergarten and 4th grade, I believe.
Yes.
Maybe 4.
And so that we added kindergarten and 4th grade a year ago. So that would have been fall of 2018.
Yeah.
And then that created 10 sections in 4th grade, and that position moved up to 5th grade. So there's now 10 sections in 5th grade.
So how many kindergartners were there classes last year versus first year this year? Is it
There's
translate?
12, you mean number of sections?
Yeah,
There's
sections.
12 this year, there were 11 last year, and were there 10 the year before? Have we gone 10, 11, 12?
Not at all.
I can't remember, 17, 18.
I was wondering, so how many more 1st grade classrooms do we have? If this keeps up?
Oh, we have a couple spare classrooms. And keeping in mind that when you add a class, so as an example, we add a class in 1st grade, that would mean that we've experienced an increase of around like 20 to 22 students
Right.
just in that grade. So as an example, comparatively, the junior high has 30 new students overall, about 10, and I don't know that it's 10 per grade, but overall, we're up by about 30 there.
which of these, positions have already been hired?
All
And the furniture and smart boards, have those already been purchased?
The classroom furniture, we ordered today. And the smart boards we put in, sometime before, maybe a few weeks ago.
Okay, so the thing that strikes me that I'm a little confused about is, these decisions were made prior to our, finding out that we have this tier 1 funding. So if the tier 1 funding hadn't come through, was this already slotted into the existing budget?
Yeah, the state board said, well, among superintendent meetings and that kind of thing, they said you can at least plan on being in tier 2. And last year we got about $250,000, so we felt very confident we would at least get that when we made some of these decisions.
But did we get, and maybe I'm just not reading it right, but didn't we get 250 and then 500 on top of that, tier 1? So combined, it was the 500?
Correct.
right.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, we're thrilled.
The challenge that we have, your question is a good one, and I think, I don't want to assume
No,
you know where you're
go
going,
on.
because they're great questions. The challenge that we have, that's everybody, I mean, this conversation might be happening literally everywhere, for especially tier 1 and tier 2 schools, who
Right.
just on August 5th found out what our tier money would be. 3 and 4 schools are all different ballgame. We interviewed 3 people for the kindergarten and first grade position. So a complicating factor here, and we were seeing this last spring as well, and I think it's getting worse the deeper you go into summer, is that we are experiencing a dire teacher shortage. And when we're in Mahomet, Seymour, when we're seeing the small candidate pools that we're seeing, we know that it's a whole lot worse in other places. So thankful that we found really excellent people to fill these positions. But we, I mean, in a sense, I hate saying we took a bit of a gamble on what the tier money would be, but we had some assurances about what it would look like. We also did have some savings from our retirees. So our retirees were placed with lower cost folks. We also have to take into consideration that we have pay increases in our collectively bargained agreements and that type of thing.
Well, we also have years of trigger number for class sizes. We've had
Right.
a policy in place for quite some time,
Yeah.
20-something, 23 maybe, and
Yeah.
that's been a guide that's been very helpful for us over the years.
So the point being, if we find out about this money on August 5th, and if we had waited to, post all of these positions, well, first of all, you're under a legal time limit for people who are under contract in other districts to leave. Sometimes that happens, but the timing of the release of the tier money is problematic. It is what it is. I'm not going to change it, because the budget gets done May 31st by the state, and then someone at ISB has to feed all of this into this formula, and it takes 2 months for us to get the information.
Even work that quickly.
So then, does that mean that what we really need to do realistically is plan next year's budget after we find out what we've gotten from the tier funding? I mean, I know we're gonna know going forward that we're gonna have this minimum amount, but I guess what I'm saying is 330,000, we're still 170, 80K less than what the tier funding ended up being. So are we just going to sit on those funds until next year? Is there a suggestion to the board of something to do with those before next year? What's the plan?
I do see, let me talk to one of your first points was,
Okay.
I think what I hear you saying is kind of, so we get the evidence-based funding money now, kind of planning with knowing now that our base funding minimum is higher, starting to talk about how do we use that for 2021. We already are. I mean,
Okay.
Dr. Rummel and I spent yesterday and today meeting with all of the teachers in the district, and we have some hot spots with class sizes in other buildings besides this building. So the wheels are starting to turn in terms of what the future's gonna look like. And that's not taking into consideration the fact that we seem to be attracting a lot of new families and kids. In terms of the gap there, Trent and I are comfortable sticking with where we're at, although there are a couple of other key positions I could suggest to add. I think I would rather look at this as the budget that's gonna be adopted, and, we have positions that we could add. Those are always gonna be, that list doesn't.
My own position is that we've been conservative in the past, and it's good to be conservative again. We don't know what's gonna pop up mid-year,
Yeah,
even for, population changes. We've been building this much stuff out here, we could end up with a January that's.
so as an example
We need
of,
more.
I don't know that I'd call it a hotspot, but I mean, we have a huge waiting list for pre-K. And so there's that.
So I understand planning for next year, but so you're thinking that the suggestion to the board is gonna be to, just hold on to those funds for this year since we weren't able to plan something fast enough? Because like you said, August 5th, I mean, that's like a week or two out. So is that the suggestion?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, so let me give you another example of why. One of our top priorities also is another instructional coach in the elementary level, probably for this building, so that Mrs. Johnson can focus her efforts just on Lincoln Trail. She's splitting her time right now, which is amazing, but an instructional coach has a huge impact on moving, learning, and achievement. There's no way we'd find somebody. And in fact, we know we have internal people who would be excellent with that, but we're also looking at, okay, I mean, right now, would we take someone out of their classroom?
Right.
So those are the kinds of decisions that we're faced with. There are two non-certified positions that I think are very important to our district right now. I think this is something that maybe the discussion can start here and go to the full board. We need what we would call a Skyward or SIS administrator. There's a massive amount of data oversight that goes on in any public school district, and districts our size and larger have oftentimes have that position. So not a teaching position, and something that you could hire and not impact classes or that kind of thing. The other thing that has been discussed and that I think we need is a communication specialist for our district. Again, if we decide that that's something that would be very valuable. So those are some ideas that are out there. I think at this point, they're not on the list. I think that this is what we're comfortable with, and that's why we're presenting it today.
Are there any requirements on EDF funds for how they're used? So, I mean, those two, I totally appreciate the need there,
Yeah.
but those two I don't think would be considered an educational position. Do EDF funds need to be used that way, or are there no strings attached with the money, or how does it work?
Great question. So there's actually in a lot, I don't want to say no strings attached. Let's say loosely attached, because the whole philosophy behind it is that you're adding staff or programs or equipment, in some cases technology. It's going to impact student learning and achievement. Some of those things are very direct and some of them are indirect. So actually, there's a recommendation in the literature about EDF that would recommend ratios of, for instance, like administrative assistants, depending upon the size of your building. There's administrative ratios that are recommended. So these are not positions that work directly with students or that you might think is really going to move learning and achievement in a really direct way, but they're going to have an impact in some way. One of the concerns, and in fact, in states where the evidence-based funding model has been implemented prior to Illinois, there's a couple of them, where it has not worked and where it's been, I don't know that I have enough knowledge about it to call it a failure, but where the funds have been ineffectively used is when they're just dumped like into a teacher's salary schedule and then just like spread evenly. The point of this formula is to find those high impact positions that you're short on. So some of those being lowering class size, instructional coaches, interventionists, counselors, social workers, psychologists, those types of things. But there are non-certified positions that you can make the case that, and you know, so, I mean, I would have to acknowledge that a communication specialist, I don't know, has that a huge impact on learning. I just think the district needs it. We're getting to be that size, and that's a pretty broad, there will be a lot of things that person could do. So great question. You're not gonna like lose money or be penalized. Now, we have an evidence-based funding expenditure that we turn in.
There is,
So we would say like, here's what we hired. Because I think that our legislators, when they passed this, were very interested in districts being held accountable for we're getting a lot more money, and we're not used to that.
Yeah, there are more reporting requirements, like Lindsay said. There also, it provides an area for some narrative on a district, gets to kind of tell their story on how they spent the money and that kind of thing too. So that's been a good opportunity in those reports.
It's nice.
What is the state of our current class sizes and in that formula? Are we getting close to the threshold for needing to add another position?
Well, so there are the ratios in the evidence-based funding model, which I don't have right at hand, and then there's a class size target. So we've
That's what
said
I'm talking about.
they're not the same.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to clarify that I'm going to ballpark this figure, but for example, like in the early primary grades under the evidence-based funding model, I mean, they're recommending like 16 or something in kindergarten. Now, in the evidence-based funding model, that is also tempered with, and what's worked into that proportionately is your percentage of low-income students for your district.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a high-poverty district, then your class size recommendations are going to be lower because we know that those students are at risk, and smaller class sizes have a larger impact on high-risk populations, low and high-poverty populations.
Mm-hmm.
We don't quite have that, although this building does have the highest percentage of low-income students.
Mm-hmm.
So we have our class size recommendations, and then the evidence-based funding model is quite a bit lower.
But if we follow their formula and we have secure funding, repeatable funding, we can work toward that.
Well, and that was the philosophy behind it, was that it's a journey toward adequacy.
Right, that's a far cry from where we've been.
It's a far cry from where we've been, and what was explained, or what is part of the formula, is that districts were expected to take like 14 years to get to adequacy. So it's not an overnight process, obviously. And as you work toward adequacy, theoretically, you're going to get less tier money. Now, we got bumped down into tier 1, partly because the threshold got raised to just above where we were.
So for our formula, where are we at on class sizes? Like second grade, third grade, so on. Are we getting close to
Yeah.
district targets?
Yes, the
As of
district
today.
targets.
Yeah, I mean, we're close, we're not over, we don't go over, I mean,
That's our trigger to add that, so that's why we had first grade and kindergarten, because we went over the above, the high end range of that limit.
I don't have the exact number.
And I'm working from memory here, but I think with that model, there was the concept of how well funded we are. Is that, am I using that?
Yeah, there's 3 different financial conditions, so in
That's it.
a balanced condition here, we'd like to see our
And are we considered currently in a balanced condition?
again, I have to circle back to that and see what those
Okay.
are. I mean, we just knew we had to add them with those 2 positions, but I can speak to that.
Okay. So this is the first time, I've been on finance committee with the school board. is this typically how the finance committee does things? I mean, the recommendations come and the finance committee needs to say yes or no, or?
This is the first time we've ever had extra money. So there really is no typical to it. I mean, we've had to scrape and, you know, not borrow literally, but in all previous years. Last year was still a bit of a mess. 2 years certainly was. So,
Even in years operating in a deficit, we added staff because we had to for the class size targets. And we just knew that was a decision made. So to Merle's point, yeah, it was just as unprecedented.
but the procedure in the past has been, we get recommendations when the hurt's too big to ignore. And, you know, grin and bear it, see what you do.
And does the board typically just say yes or no, or do they make choices? Like, coming in today, I expected to see like an array of choices and us to discuss what our priorities would be.
This has already been through the professionals. You've already listed half a dozen things that you can't even consider at this point. So finance committee can look at it and say, hey, if they, you know, if they've done their homework, yeah. And the board then typically, since it's been through the professionals, through a finance committee with a blessing, and not that we take a vote and say, hey, we're good with this, but we can then recommend whatever is proposed at a board meeting, because we've already had the briefing and so forth and so on. Happens with all the committees. If somebody on the committee has already been through it, it's like, God bless you, you know this better than any of the rest of us on a recommendation that helps.
So Ken, I think, I think I understand what you're after, and the challenge that we have is that, like, we could not make those choices now. But I think so moving ahead, that's a conversation probably for like February or March, looking ahead to the next year, would be bringing forth recommendations from the administration to the board to say, here's where we see our needs.
Great.
And like telling the board, here are our priorities. Do you have different ones? Do you have questions we can answer? But the timing of the budget cycle is really lousy to have that, because it's a great conversation to have. We just can't have it on August 15th in terms of adding certified positions.
That goes back to the certainty of funding. If we have a certainty of funding and we get this 500 every year, that means the conversation in the wintertime might have legs.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions about the budget overall? We kind of go back from here.
Well, positive is
Like,
negative.
what would you say to add? Like let's say right now it's March. Pretend it's March.
Well, I'd be very curious to know about the class size numbers, and what's nice about having a discussion in March is that we have stable registration, because I know people are still registering today. But, that would probably be number one on our list, is to try and do that, but really, I mean, you guys are in the building, you're working with these teachers. I would wanna know what are the options that is being suggested there, and then let us define priorities. So it's not like, yeah, I mean, so that's how I would like to see it done. And if that's the right timeline, that's fine with me.
And all that sounds good, and since this EBF is so new, there's only been
Sure.
3 of us, maybe 4 of us, that really tried to understand what that rubric all means and so forth. So you got 4 of them in this room right now. So, you know, we need to continue to learn what that means and how it impacts what the priorities are that EBF suggests for us, so we don't ignore that.
You know, another question about the EBF that just occurred to me. We were saying that, I think it was said that those positions and the other purchases there, they were coming from the tier 2 funding that we were expected to have. But the year previous, when we got that tier 2 funding, did we have positions that we created there with that tier 2 funding? And how are we paying for those old 2017 positions this year? Do you know what I mean?
Well, since it's hold harmless, it goes backwards, so that funding is stable at that point. That's how you continue funding them moving forward. In terms of this time, I guess, the tier two funding last year, again, the class sizes, that's always the kind of the top priority, so we knew we're growing and adding registration there.
So I guess what I'm saying is, my point was wrong, that we don't have a $170K gap, because whatever we added in 2017, that was being paid the tier two amount, the
Right, which is still built in now the base funding minimum.
And the stuff we're adding this year, it just so happens we had this tier one come along, and that's gonna cover that.
That's correct, yeah.
Mhm.
So now we have, it's a fresh $509,000 in tier funding this year. As opposed to what we thought we were gonna get tier two, maybe around 250, and again, it's not added to that, it's instead of.
Right.
And the 509 is the total evidence-based funding we got this year.
Correct.
It will be by the end of the year, yes.
Yeah, okay.
So then that then becomes our jumping off point, the base for, so that's where you, that's.
FY 21's base
You
funding
never go
minimum.
backwards with your base funding minimum.
Right, and so to further solidify the point, in 2021, realistically, we're not gonna have a significant increase in the evidence-based model funds. I mean, it may go up.
It depends on what Springfield funds.
It depends on what they allocate to education,
Yeah.
it depends on.
I know, but I mean, what I'm saying is this year's jump was because we also had the tier one. There's nowhere else to go past tier
Oh,
one.
right.
There'll be a slight increase, so it's not like we can talk about adding too much more in 21.
Did our adequacy percentage did not go down
It went down.
by
We're at 56.09%, now we're at 55 point something percent.
265?
Yes, I do,
Okay.
sorry.
I was like, wait, we're not in.
Yeah, no, it's 55. Yeah, the threshold, yeah, so the threshold last year was 66.
So we dropped a little bit,
Yeah.
but then the threshold was also raised. But then the other factor that's out there is that where your position is also relative to all the other school districts in the state as well, and so.
Which is why it takes until now to get that information out, all 921 of them or whatever, because we're all at each other's
How many
mercy.
schools are in tier one?
It was somewhere between 300 and 400. 3 something, yeah, I believe.
So if another 100 schools just get worse dramatically, we could be impacted and stuck in tier two. That's the wild card.
That's good questions, okay. Anything else with the budget? We can dive deeper if you'd like anywhere else.
Is there anything as the finance committee need to do today with the budget? Or is that,
No,
Okay.
we'll bring it to the full board as it is.
okay,
I mean, we could quibble on whether we want 4% in the EV or not, but
well, that strikes me as reasonable.
yeah, me too.
Off the top, we talked about the mandated categorical, should we assume 2, should we assume 3, and that whole atmosphere has changed a little bit where, let's hope for 4, but just budget 3, so.
Yeah.
The conversations have evolved over the years, depending on, there's been a lot of changes.
I don't know how stuck we were.
Yeah.
What did we do last year?
So it's
No.
for
Get it more.
categoricals.
We have, I think they caught up on ones, I think we have 4 payments. Each payment's about $150,000, so we're talking about a fair amount of money, but, relative to the evidence base. Let's hope. All right. So, yeah, if we don't have any questions further on the budget, we can cruise along here. Ken, you had emailed me some requests to kind of talk about long-term debt a little bit along with some steps, so I have some information on that, and yeah, you can go to the next handout there as well. So this is, of course, kind of small. Did I print this page out? I don't know if I did. You might have to look behind you, guys. Okay, well so what we have there with the landscape version that you all have, those are the individual issuances that we have outstanding. Up on the screen is just all the same bonds, the same long-term debt, and then the starting balance in July 1st, 2018, and the ending balance in July 30, 2019. Really just kind of showing last year's activity. This is straight from what you'll see in the audit that's coming in September. Cliff Larson Allen did complete this portion of the audit, and he was willing to send it to me. So, Ken, one of your questions, what is our current long-term debt? As of the beginning of last fiscal year, 47.3 million, and we landed at the end of the year, 34.4.
Sorry, the 47 is the beginning of,
That's the amount of the original issue back when we, sold. For
okay.
example, the 2009, the top one, it was issued in July 2009. The original issuance amount was close to 8.3 million. But the principal amount remaining is the outstanding balance July 1st, minus what we retired, paid off last year, and then the outstanding ending balance is the far right column. That makes sense. Then we have some of the individual debts below that, about the tractor back in 2015, the Dell server, firewall, the internet switching in 2017, October 2017 for the high school and junior high, leading into the Chromebook initiative, and the actual Chromebooks in that first year we took that on last year. I'll just make note too that the bonds, and I add the layer here, the bonds that are now highlighted on the screen, those in like a light red, I think, are paid for by 1% sales tax as opposed to property taxes. So those are not on the property tax rules. Every January we do an abatement that removes those payments from the tax rules. And in the light blue are the debt certificates that, while they're still in the tax rolls, we do a transfer from the capital projects fund to the debt service fund to effectively pay those with 1% sales tax. Just to show kind of the difference between the two.
So last year we paid about 600,000 from the 1% using those transfers. Am I reading that right? Because that's how much was retired for those two blue ones?
Yeah, in principle, yeah.
Okay.
So we're also going to talk a little bit about debt capacity, kind of a projection outward. This goes out to 2036. I guess starting in 2019, that first column is just the remaining principal, or the amount we're paying during that year. And then the second column is the remaining principal to pay, and the third column is our debt capacity each year moving forward, all the way through 2032 when we pay off all the existing debt. This does not include, or excludes those same alternate revenue source bonds. They don't count toward the debt limit because of, I think they include the law in the handout too, but it's called the Local Government Debt Reform Act.
So this is the real debt limit, contrary to what the state's webpage.
Right, so the state's webpage, and that's been a long running discussion with the School Business Services Department at ISB. Lawfully, they should not be including any alternate revenue source bonds in the financial profile score. Actually, I called the division administrator there way back. Yeah, we've always kind of known that, we've never really changed it, and that's about what we were doing. Anyway, the debt capacity does account, or EAV is a component within that formula. This just assumes a 1% increase in EAV annually, which is incredibly conservative, but better to be conservative than assume way too much. So that debt capacity each year is that far right column, though. You can see that far behind it. Any questions with any of that?
Can you go back one slide?
Of course.
Which of these issues are callable?
Yeah, so that would be on the individual sheet here. If it says, okay, so here's the call. It's the second from the bottom, non-callable. This one's callable. It has the date. So at that time, we could pay it off early. We could refund, or we could kind of refinance at that time.
Yeah,
So those will be listed on the individual sheets.
great. Thank you very much.
Like Kevin Hyde wanted to be here from Stiefel. Next surgery, couldn't make it, but he and his associates still put some of this information together for me. So
Okay.
they were very critical.
So that 34 million for outstanding debt includes alternate bonds.
It does.
What's our total without it?
Oh,
25? Is that the next page?
no. Well, let's see. And again, the blues would still the local government debt reform that don't apply to those, so we'd be backing up.
18 or 19 million, that's like,
So we've got 5 million coming off in bond payments in the next 2 years, so that'd be almost 20% of it.
Right.
That's a good chunk.
So, can you foresee any ongoing debt that we're gonna be having to add each year, like the Dell servers or the firewalls, or any other large? I mean, I know one of them is the middle school, discussion, but is there any other big debt that you think we're gonna need to be dealing with in the next 5-10 years?
Not that we foresee right now. We have some vehicle needs, but lately we've been saving up and just buying those outright, van for transportation department, that kind of thing.
Well, probably some financing for the field house renovation, right?
Right, I guess there will be a portion of that, that's true.
So what drives that is surprises that aren't completely covered in the take out of the sales tax piece that we would do for improvements. So that if something else moves and we gotta replace 5 boilers all of a sudden, and that's not in the summer budget already, we might have to finance something like that.
Is there anything in the current budget, proposed budget, to fund the field house renovations?
Yeah, so assuming that's the next priority, and I believe it is, I did within the capital projects fund, I'm just gonna go back a few, budget for a certain portion, I think maybe $300,000, still within this fiscal year. Usually, for summer projects, we get the bills in August and September, finish paying those off, so really that would be FY '21. In FY '20, I planned on maybe $300,000 for that project to be paid within this fiscal year.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that we're thinking ahead of that to try and reduce our need to use that for that kind of project.
Absolutely, yeah, so at the July 15th board meeting, we talked a little bit about facilities, the current list of facilities
Yeah.
priorities. And then we landed with how much money we have to spend each year out of the 1% sales tax. This coming summer, we're looking at about $600,000 that we'll have available to us. So the 300,000 of that will be in FY '20 on a projected basis here. It might be nothing to pay.
Just imagine what it was like before sales tax.
Yeah.
In all likelihood, it probably will fall into FY '21. For that project, we've already paid the architect fees, it's already been designed, that kind of thing. Usually those are some of the expenses you see up front. I doubt we get a pay application from a contractor before the end of the fiscal year, but better to have it in there, so. Right. Merle, you let me know when you need to
Yeah, I can,
stop.
right at the top of the hour.
That's your call, okay. Okay, so we talked about debt capacity. Ken, you also asked if we could kind of touch on the current TIF district. For those who don't know what a TIF district is, tax increment financing, essentially an economic tool. Well, you can read there, but it locks the value of a TIF district, the value within a TIF district at this base level, as it says in the shows an illustration, and then as values increase over time, that increment amount is redirected back into the TIF district to continue economic development, whether it's adding more infrastructure or that kind of thing. So, do we all know that much anyway? Okay, that makes sense. So our current TIF district was established in 2000. That's set to expire 2023. Those are typically 23 years. And we, in that agreement, get 50% of the increment for commercial development and 100% flow through for the increment for residential development. So there's really no effect in terms of any residential within the TIF on the school district anyway. For the commercial, really the only sacrifice, so to speak, would be the other 50% of the commercial development that we otherwise captured in EAV, but we are still seeing 50% of that flow through to the schools from the village. Just a side note, that also flows through the county, and those payments were late as well. We haven't really talked about that in the last few months, but we did see a huge influx. Kind of the normal payments we would have received by now anyway, but all in July instead of June, which really adds to those negative balances we had at the end of FY19. But just an added
Do you
side
know
note.
the history of the EAV and the TIF on the commercial side?
I don't. That's something the village, I think they have.
It should,
records,
that
yeah.
might be worth
And
just
or the
pulling
county.
out,
Yeah, that would be
just to know whether it's accelerated any year recently. I mean, we know there's been construction, but I don't have a good sense for what's been in that,
That would be interesting.
inside the lines.
Aside from the strip malls in front of the school here, is there any other commercial development?
I'm gonna, I made that so it could be bigger too. We can kind of see what's within that. I
Some
mean,
stuff out by McDonald's, the bank.
yeah, it goes up.
Oh,
Right, but the
oh,
north,
yeah, you're right,
yeah, the north side of 150 and all the way to the interstate.
yeah, you're right.
Is that farm credit there too?
Yeah, it is.
So,
Well, farm credit, well, you said it established in 2000, when did
2000.
farm credit go in? I don't even know.
It was around
It was-
that time, and it was built as Roberson Trucking.
You're right, it was
Oh.
commercial before that.
Yeah, it was not originally farm credit.
That's probably the base, but.
But then, so the whole little area around, I believe, is Carl in there, and Fisher National Bank on the west end.
Oh, does it connect that? Yeah.
Carl isn't in it, but see, right here,
so legitimate.
that's Carl, isn't
Yeah.
it? And this little area is commercial.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Right.
Fisher.
Yeah,
Awesome.
like dentist in there.
So in 2023, do we just go back to, I mean, this just evaporates and then we get the full commercial, tax revenues?
I believe, yeah, and TIF, all of the value otherwise just going to tax rolls and.
Without a replacement. The ultimate, well, unless there's some interest in replacing
Oh.
a TIF that then
But the base would reset though, if they started a new tip, right? They couldn't extend this tip, could they?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the base will be.
we've got, compared to other aggressive TIFs for development, we're treated pretty favorably in this thing, so.
Most of us, nothing flows back to you.
Right, usually we wouldn't even get 50%, we'd give it all up, so we're the biggest tax entity in the TIF, and would have a lot of negotiating power because of that. Depends on how aggressive we wanna be in the whole commercial development.
So how do these TIFs get decided? Do we actually have authority on that, or is it just the village of Mahomet?
I wasn't here back in 2000, I'm not sure how that all.
We're a partner in that,
With all the tax.
because they can't
advisors that
do
are-
anything, so it's an intergovernmental agreement essentially.
Okay,
They can't do anything without us, without our.
Without our-
There's a
agreement.
TIF board made up of the taxing body representation.
okay.
So it meets, at least once a year,
They're required to meet annually, the last meeting was January.
January.
And that's how the huge flow through numbers does happen, back in whatever year it was put in, the board at that time, I wasn't around then, but they insisted on.
I didn't wanna give it all up.
For us.
Could a taxing body hold up a TIF?
We could, we don't agree, because we're the biggest player in the finance.
So is the authority based on the amount of tax revenue you get, or something like that? I don't know how the TIF
Yeah,
works.
well, I don't know the answer to that question.
That
I don't know if it goes
decides
proportional to-
how to use funds that go into that TIF account, which is essentially 50% of the commercial increase.
I think all the taxing bodies have to sign off on it, so regardless of what your portion is, everybody's gotta agree to do it, I think. Again, none of us were around when this was put in place.
I don't know what the other taxing bodies' proportions are, all I know is what the school district 50% is.
And so
But
we'd be
it's-
looking at, you'd be looking at like the library district and the fire district and all that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
library, Corn Belt,
All of
Parkland, the
them.
county,
And
the
nominally,
township.
it's intended to do capital infrastructure,
Yeah,
because it's hard to get that funded any other way.
so possible for one of those funding bodies to just step out of the district during those negotiations? You know, for example, if the library board were to say, we're not gonna get anything out of this, so if you guys wanna do TIF, you do TIF, we're out. Could they do that?
Probably,
So
anyhow,
we'll answer that.
I'm seeing that clock's a little slow over there, so I'm looking at 2:59.
Any questions?
Okay. So sorry, I think you had another slide. I'll let you talk. Oh, that's it? Okay.
You did have another slide.
That's a great thing.
Worked out well.
You had that scheduled, didn't you?
Yeah, right.
Do you want to set a next meeting date real quick?